All right, everyone. Trump is coming out and thinking about reshuffling his economic plan in order to stave off the possibility of a recession. Why do I get the feeling that there's not going to be a recession? Like, he doesn't think there will be a looming recession, but he's trying to use the threat of it, like the fact that there are economic indicators that got some people that don't like him anyway spooked. It looks almost like he's trying to drum that up, like play chaos candidate mode and say like, well, yeah, maybe it'll happen. Like in public, he's like, don't worry, the economy's fine, but in private, he's like, well, nudge, nudge, could have a problem. The way to solve this, lower the interest rates, which he's jostled for before anyway to try to stimulate economic growth, and number two, get rid of or lower the payroll tax. This looks like a way around Congress to try to spook them into allowing another tax cut for the lower and working class. The payroll tax disproportionately affects the lowest rung of Americans. I think it would be a great thing if they eliminated the idea altogether. But I would go further if I were Trump. I would advocate for the abolition of most taxation. Both state and federal, it's not necessary. As people become more sophisticated and communication becomes more sophisticated, so long as we can make sure that government is capable of interacting with business, private enterprises in such a way that it's preventing abuse, that's really the only proper purpose of government at all. Governments are established to prevent abuse. Why does everything from a simple tribal chiefdom all the way up to the most post-nationalist states all operate on the same fundamental principle of organizational capacity anyway? The idea is like some medieval village. They get together, they have their soldiers and stuff, and that can be potentially spawn abuse, but the initial reason why you want soldiers or a leader or something is to prevent some other group from abusing you. The problem is, of course, if you empower it too much, it begins abusing you natively. It becomes worse than the idea of invasion. Domestic problems have become a bigger problem for most nations around the world now than foreign entities. Invasion by foreign powers is less prevalent for most of the more developed countries. Unfortunately, now they face invasion from within. What happens is the government becomes tyrannical and starts abusing its own population. We see this here in the U.S. There are increasing calls for confiscating firearms, which is unconstitutional and authoritarian, to up the tax rate, to force people to pay for bullshit that we don't need, to try to start wars, to antagonize other countries. It's a layer of decadence that we're suffering from our own success. We don't have anyone invading us or the possibility of that, so they have to justify big government. Ideally, we shrink it. Ideally, what happens in the technological era is we realize we can fundamentally communicate with one another. We can understand one another's cultures. Our literacy, our awareness can be far higher than it was in the past as long as we structure things properly. We need to strike a balance. We need to prevent governments from abusing people. Communication is the main way in which you do that. We need to prevent our own governments from doing that as much as foreign entities, and we need to prevent private entities from doing the same. As long as we can create balance and create enough stringency to prevent totalitarian styles of abuse at any point along the way, as long as we get those power poles to oppose one another rather than trying to enable one another like a bunch of drug fiends, everything's fine. We don't need as much government. We can probably cut taxes by 50% across the world. Allow private individuals to primarily have the means of production, to primarily have the results of that production, to ingratiate and make themselves more wealthy, rather than centralizing it in governments that are becoming vestigial. Centralized power structures over time are becoming less necessary even as they grow. Post-nationalism, multinationalism, that is globalization, is a cancer. The globalized world, that's the opposite of what we need. We need to go in the other direction. We don't need a global authority. What we need is the recension of some of the powers of nation states. We literally need to take a step backwards as we move forward because it's no longer necessary. The situation that led to the modern nation state in the interventionist sense, being necessary or being efficient, has gone away. The impetus to create such a form of government no longer exists. Private individuals are now capable of the organizational capacity. The automation, drones and the internet and shit like that has made it unnecessary for some of those powers of modern government to exist at all. So I fully support Trump. This is funny because I remember during the 2016 election, Trump came out. I mean, shortly thereafter, when Trump came out with his first tax reform package and said, well, we're cutting this tax and that tax, it was funny to watch Gary Johnson. He was the Libertarian candidate. He did fairly well. I mean, it's not like he didn't get millions of votes. Comes and says, well, yeah, even he, as a never-Trumper almost, is like, yeah, I support it. I just wish that more taxes would go the way of the dinosaur. That's sort of how I feel. By the way, fiscal conservatism, in the real sense, I don't mean the neocon sense of, well, we'll lower the business tax rate by 0.5%, then we'll start a war, so we'll just tax, the middle class more. That's what the Bush Republicans would do, a bunch of slimy assholes. What I believe in is that the government abuses you less typically if it has less resources to do so. That's why I'm a fiscal conservative. Authoritarianism gets starved if it doesn't have enough money. Look, it's like Razorfist pointed out a long time ago with the FBI scandal involving Comey and the Mueller probe and stuff. That was initially not even meant to be a permanent fixture of the U.S. government. Most of the agencies, most of the sacred cow programs and agencies and taxes and fees and regulations, welfare, most of what government does was never intended initially, or at least sold as being intended as being permanent. Most of it was branded as temporary. Hey, we need this for a while. We need this program for a while to get some orphans back on their feet. We'll end it once that happens. But it never ends. Because bureaucrats get involved and they start making problems. They make problems to justify their own continued existence. Usually not just their continued existence, but their increased existence. Oh, we need more staff. We need more offices. We need more expensive desks and more pensions. That's what ends up happening. It'll slowly strangulate the U.S. economy and make us like the boring old world economies, where people have to suffer with a 50-60% tax rate. Have you looked at the tax systems of some European nations? When people on the left here say we should be more like Europe, I say, fucking crazy. You don't know what you're talking about. There's a reason we're the only country in the world with significant projective force. Part of that is because we have the ability to pay for such things. You're talking about indulging in economic systems that would rob us of that ability. You're talking about the overthrow of the current Western-aligned world order entirely. I believe in Americanism. I believe totally in American exceptionalism. What other form of exceptionalism am I supposed to believe in? I'm an American. I'm not a European. I'm not from Africa or Australia or Latin America. I'm from the United States. Of course I'm going to believe in American exceptionalism. It benefits me. It benefits my family. It benefits my nation. So yeah, I believe in it completely. If other people from other countries, you have your own exceptionalism, you should. You should be a cutthroat. You should absolutely push for things you think will strengthen your nation. You don't have any fucking loyalty to my flag or anything like that. You're Australian or Brazilian or whatever. But in that hyper-competitive, very capitalistic style sense, we should all try to get along. We can solve our own problems in the voluntary, privatized sense. What's happened is that the power structures are afraid that we'll solve our own problems, so they're trying to crack down on things like the internet in order to make more of them. Because that's what centrality does. It's like a cancer. It's corruption. So yeah, get rid of the payroll tax altogether. Get rid of all the taxes you can. Shrink government as much as fiscally possible. Now it's hard because, of course, some of these bureaucrats, they have partners in big business that have corrupted them, and they give money to people in Congress. So it's very difficult to rescind any spending. That's basically, it's an enabling. What happens is that the same government that became centralized, we're talking the progressive era, it begins centralizing to prevent abuse by private entities, then ends up being bought by the private entities. Now we have Citizens United. It's way, way worse than it was then. We look back, we read our history books about the Gilded Era, the barons, the coal barons and steel barons, the carpetbagging era, and the progressives and Teddy Roosevelt. We read about that period of some decades of business corruption and monopolies and trusts and price fixing and shitty conditions for workers and general lack of growth of the purchasing power of the lower class and child labor and ignorance. We read about that era and we say, oh my God, what a horrible time and how great those progressives were. Well, the progressives failed and we're in a far worse Gilded Age now. It's gilded in silicon right now. That's the problem, is that the communication structures are owned by the new barons of the modern era that put the Rockefellers and all of those people to shame. Penny for penny, adjusted for inflation, at least on paper, Silicon Valley is so much more wealthy than the people that ran the rail companies and the coal companies and stuff like that back then. There's no attempt to do anything. We got Citizens United, so they've paid off Congress. But they haven't paid Trump off because he was one of them. He's one of those 80s and 90s sort of yuppie billionaires. And, you know, he gilds everything in gold, too, and likes the Art Deco and the diamond-encrusted bathtubs and all of the fineries of life. He uniquely, it's sort of like an FDR thing. FDR was harder to bribe because he was already filthy rich. Now, of course, he was nuts, but, you know, and a bigot and a bitter cripple. But Donald Trump isn't. He's not bigoted. Yeah, FDR was the rich bigot that we've had in office for too long. I would have voted for Wilkie at that point. That's about all. Peace out.